Hello, everyone. I'm Rocky Latka, and I'm pleased to introduce our keynote speaker. Dustin Kangas is the cloud CTO for Cognizant Softvision. He's got over 20 years of a unique blend of leadership, technical, operational, and executive. And he's coming to us here to talk about how to optimize and transform your business culture and technology, specifically around this concept of FinOps. And kind of an odd term. I don't know if he's going to go into spreadsheets or exactly where we're going here, but I do know that cost management, especially when you think about the cloud, is in the top 5, often the #1 concern of many organizations. Personally, I know I've run into some extraordinary cloud bills unexpectedly, and I'm sure many of you have as well. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dustin, and I think he's going to kick it off with some great interactions. So take it away, Dustin. Thank you.
Thank you, Rocky. I'm going to go ahead and, thank you, Rocky, for introducing me. Welcome, everyone, to Programmers Week. I am very excited to be presenting to you today around the topic of FinOps. As Rocky said, I've been doing this for quite some time, and we've all ran into the scenario of how we build cost management overall for the cloud. It's presented a new model. It presents a new way of how we're thinking and how we're dealing with the overall costs within the cloud. So to start, I just want to take a few minutes and kind of level set where we're at with cost and cost management in the FinOps practice. And so taking this quick quiz, use your chats to answer so we can see them coming through. Kind of want to start, got 4 questions to ask everybody around, how much do you know about FinOps? What do you think it comes from? So the first one is the origin. When was the term FinOps created? This is something that's relatively new. Rocky brought it up, right? We talk about cost management, but when was the term FinOps actually coined? Was it, in the last, in 2015, 2016, 2019, 2020? So as we're getting chats kind of coming up, I'll go ahead and reveal the answer here. So it's actually in 2016. And so it really originated from the Phoenix project book when they had the definition of DevOps that was then translated to being FinOps with the AWS Public Sector Summit of 2016. So the term was actually first used at that point in time. If you said 2019, again, you could be correct there too, because once again, it became more mainstream and it was presented at Google Cloud Conference in 2019. And then additionally, in 2020 is even more prominent. That's actually when the official book was released on FinOps for purchase. That's when it began to get integrated into FinOps.org as an overall process and understanding that we're going into. So the next question here coming up is, what are some of the financial terms that we use in the lexicon of FinOps? So when we're talking about FinOps, what are some of the things that we're looking at? Is it day sales outstanding? Is it matching principal? Is it gross margin or return on assets? And so we're thinking about what are some of the defining financial terms for FinOps. This really is matching principal. And matching principal is key to the definition of FinOps. And this is kind of where, going looking at some spreadsheets where we look at accrual-based accounting versus cash-based accounting. When we purchase and buy from cloud service providers, we want to look at when those services were used, not when those services were billed and the invoice created. That allows us to then get better metrics that we'll talk about here in a little bit. Next one is around tags. How many tags do the cloud service providers support in general? And we have 35 all the way up to 75. So here the answer is actually a trick question. It's both B and C. So Azure and AWS support up to 50 tags for most resources. GCP will support up to 64 tags for those resources. And then the last question, right? What is the most important goal to measure success in FinOps? Is it savings, control, sustainability, or credibility? So the answer there is actually it's credibility. So I know when we're talking about FinOps, we're talking about how do we save? How do we manage costs and improve efficiency? But what we're really trying to do in the world of FinOps is build credibility, because that builds trust. And when we have trust with our stakeholders, then we can actually build upon that and work towards a better future. So when we build a credibility, we can then give visibility into what we want to see in the future. So how did FinOps kind of start out? What does the journey look like? And why are we talking about FinOps? We've been surprised by the big bills, and that really stems from moving from project to products and how that journey kind of starts. So when we're moving from projects to products, we started off with a financial model that was equated to how data centers were run and how we ran projects in the past. We had quarterly business reviews. We had backward-looking financial reporting. We had long, drawn-out capacity planning processes. And my start on my journey into the cloud really started because of these procurement processes and these financial models that didn't meet the need to have velocity, the need to have better product impact, the need to have better quality in what we're building. So as we move from projects to products in our mindset, and we're building the pod model out, we started seeing some new adjusting pieces to the frameworks that were there. We talked about getting surprise cloud bills. That is something that, we see exponential growth. As we gained velocity, we saw more products go in the cloud, more products in the cloud meant more spend. The higher the spend rates, the bigger the bills that we're seeing. We're also seeing surprising cloud bills because we need to have education of resources on how to be more cost effective in the cloud. And so we start seeing those bills coming up. We also see a surprising thing that wasn't recognized initially in the marketplace, and that was really budget burn. So we accounted for resources, we accounted for time for development, we accounted for all those things. But then when it actually went and got into production, into environments, there was a new cost, there was a new operational expense coming from the cloud service providers that then added to our budget burn that was not necessarily accounted for or understood clearly in our original budgets. So then we start responding to this. We start adjusting. We start thinking, okay, that cloud bill has most likely gone to some IT operational budget that is essentially controlled. And now I've got to look and say, well, how do I actually charge it back to the right P&Ls that are actually doing the work? How do I get it out of a centralized control mechanism into enablement of my pods to manage their own budgets? So they have that visibility and they can see it. And how can I then transform my pods to really have that balance of delivery and cost? And what we see happen is a phenomenon that we call spend panic. And that's basically the initial response, is this understanding of spend panic, out of control costs, and we need to make changes. Quite often, the most dramatic change that we have is change in leadership. This is fundamentally causes a rewrite of the cloud to something that I call Cloud 2.0, Cloud 3.0. New leadership comes in with new tools, preferred vendors, preferred cloud service providers that may be different and changing, and wants to implement those structures with those new tool sets. And that causes significant delays overall within the projects. The other thing that we've seen too is actually a moving back away from cloud to the traditional private cloud models, but bringing FinOps patterns, bringing agile patterns into the private data center. We've seen that with companies like Dropbox that have significantly reduced costs over time by bringing that back in-house instead of being on the cloud. We have increased scrutiny, which becomes, part of the vernacular of the teams where we're looking and implementing processes to give greater visibility. So we start creating additional review boards, like architectural review processes, pieces in place that are trying to manage those costs up front and try to determine what they are ultimately reducing our team's velocities and quality. We see reorganization of resources to try to save costs. And this can be in multiple different aspects when we talk about reorganization of resources, in that the resources themselves, could be delivered in one cloud environment to get visibility, but then we want an opportunity to redeploy those resources into improved technology standards. We want to deploy them in a way that is more cost effective in what we're doing and trying to change how we're managing some of the patterns there. But ultimately, at the end of the day is that we impact delivery. So resources are now being redirected to new priorities. We slow down delivery, we impact velocity, and potentially impact quality of what we're trying to do. So how do we solve this? How do we solve for cost without impacting the teams and trying to drive the culture change that we want to do? And that's where concepts like FinOps comes from. So understand where FinOps came from. We need to first look and say, well, what is DevOps, right? If FinOps is the principle that built from DevOps back in 2016, so what is DevOps? And then our definition of DevOps, right, is really to build collaboration between the business, the product development, the engineers, the IT operation teams that are there, and using tool sets to kind of create that culture that we're looking for. I always say that DevOps very much is culture driven, and that's kind of how we do things and how we work and how we build teams. We can have communities of DevOps that are focused on the practice and the tools, and then we can bring those pieces together to provide the cultural change. And so what does that mean from a FinOps perspective? So FinOps really just is the collaboration, bringing DevOps culture, DevOps principles to financials, to something that is much more traditional in what we've been doing. And it really results in looking at the view from a much more data-driven perspective, and really looking and focusing on how do we create efficiencies and how do we build more profitable software products overall. And there are 6 underlying principles that we're going to talk about today related to FinOps. Some of these are directly from FinOps, or some of these are more from my experience going through this. And some of the wording has changed a little bit because I believe that we got to kind of augment what we're doing to make it meet our expectations. So the first part of this will be governance, and then we'll talk about autonomy, and then we'll talk about kind of the FinOps lifecycle and how that really builds collaboration, real-time visibility, improvement of business decisions, and kind of how we manage costs and how we ingrain that into our processes, into our teams to really build what we're looking for. So to start, when we talk about governance, what does governance look like? This is very similar to the Cloud Center of Excellence concepts, where we want to build a FinOps community, a practice where we can implement our organizational governance models that are going to be in place. And so we want to bring a team together in a community that is going to develop our overall culture and help promote it within the organization. And there are multiple roles that need to be defined when we talk about FinOps and the FinOps community. And so if you're working within the organizations or you're working on teams doing large cloud opportunities, ask yourself, is there a role there today called the Director of Cloud Optimization, for example? Someone who is really looking at how do we build products that not only have velocity, not only have delivery, but also have costs impacted to them. And the Director of Cloud Optimization is not necessarily a technical resource. Generally, technical resources do not like spreadsheets and accounting, in my experience. So what we really need to do is look and say, okay, let's take that resource that has a really good understanding of our financial operating model, of how to manage and control costs and budget, but is also very technically savvy. And so we can apply that to the complex models that are within the cloud. And then that team is then augmented with engineers, right? The builders of FinOps. And the engineers are the blood of what's going on within the FinOps model, because it's the engineers who are taking on the responsibility of being buyers in the new marketplace. No longer do we have to go through complex procurement processes. We can now be buyers in what we're doing, and the engineers can help us build that, but also provide the mechanisms to continue to grow and evolve the model. As we create automations, as we create different data models, we can apply AML tools to this in order to give better forecasting and understand delivery. And then we have our financial and procurement resources. And their role is really to provide visibility. They want to be able to see what the financials are. They want to make sure that we have that credibility that we talked about building earlier. We really wanted to start forecasting our costs because we want to move from a back-thinking model to a forward-thinking model. And we need the financial and procurement resources to be able to do that. This is all stems from, the migration of how we got from a capital expenditure to an operating expenditure model. And then we forget that in an operating expenditure model, without the participation of finance and procurement, we can't change from backwards capacity planning models to future forecasting models where we can then take advantage of discounts and rates and features that cloud providers have. So financial procurement are critical to this. And then finally, we have our executive leadership. And the executive leadership team can come from the CCOE, can be your CIO, your CTO, but they're the champions of the culture change. They're champions of building autonomy within the pod structure, within the model. And they're really focused on how do we kind of move that forward. So when we're talking about autonomy in that model, how do we enable our pods and our teams to be autonomous? And I think the first piece that here in my first part of differentiating from traditional FinOps in the model is really the terms that we use. Even this week, I was having a conversation with my wife about, the difference between accountability and autonomy. And it stemmed from personal experience with my family and stuff like that, and saying, well, people need to be held accountable for their behavior. And as we talked about it, I said, well, that really goes back to the fundamental principle of, is it a carrot or is it a stick? And when I say accountability, it feels very much like a stick, like it's being punished for behaviors that don't meet expectations. Instead, let's shift this and look at how do we have autonomy? Because autonomy then is all about empowerment and doing cost avoidance and preventing overhead that's within the overall systems. And so we can look at what are the behaviors we're trying to model within the pod to apply to cost and bring cost forward as we're talking. And so there's 4 key goals that are part of that. The first piece of this is just business autonomy. This is empowering our pods to make business decisions, to produce business impacts. And when our engineers are involved in making the business decisions, they have ownership of those decisions. And with that ownership comes a sense of pride that we can do. And then we can use tools like Game of Pods to gamify what those business decisions are, what the metrics are that we're trying to measure to really engage pods to do better delivery and to understand cost as part of the delivery process. Then we talk about financial autonomy, right? Engineers are now the buyers. They make the decisions on what services and features to implement, and they are responsible then to the cost and the budget that the team owns. But they need to be able to see this, and that's where visibility comes into play. So we talked about having 50 plus tags that are available to it that can actually be used to understand cost. And when we provide visibility, we can create what's known as the Prius effect. And the Prius effect stems from a study back in 2011 with Berkeley that looked at drivers of the Prius and how they reacted to the real-time analytics of gasoline consumption within the vehicles. And what they found is that just through the display of real-time analytics to the drivers, most drivers behaved in a way that would evolve to reduce gasoline consumption. So they would actually purposely drive in a way that would decrease their fuel consumption because they could see that being displayed to them real time. This is the same thing when we think about visibility and how it's going to impact engineers. Engineers already have a sense of pride and belonging to what they're trying to build. And if we can empower that through real-time analytics and visibility, they're naturally going to want to reduce the cost. They're wanting to build better products. They're going to want to make more cost-effective solutions and build those out. So the only way that we can really do that and help the engineers and help the teams is by promoting self-autonomy. And self-autonomy is all about how do we educate, how do we train, and how do we bring awareness to our engineers so that they can build much more cost-effective solutions. And as part of that, when we're talking today, it starts with bridging the gap between engineers and finance. And so in order to do that, we have to agree upon a common lexicon. I believe that our words are very important and they matter. And when we talk, we need to talk in a way that is understanding to build that collaboration. And FinOps is very complex, and it's bridging two very unique lexicons that are going to be there. And so how do we drive that? How do we drive that behavior so everyone's talking the same language as we continue to move forward? The first part of this is billing. Cloud billing is very complex. And frankly, it is not able to have humans understand it. It is designed in a way that clouds, just the billing concept, when we think about how do we calculate spend, right? That is usage and rate. And both usage and rate on spend calculations are not defined in a way that is easy to understand or calculate. So when we think of usage and rate, these aren't $1 for 1 hour, right? That's not how a lot of the bills are calculated. They're calculated on hundreds of pennies, or pennies per minute, per microsecond, per gigabyte, per megabyte, per small units that scale. And so all of a sudden we think of looking and going, well, I'm only incurring a cost that's 3 cents. And so it makes it easy to forget about, well, that's 3 cents over multiple transactions that are happening simultaneously within the ecosystem that are going across hundreds of services that will be with hundreds of applications that are running in the cloud. And bills become extremely complicated. And to compound this even more is that by default, the cloud service providers, their visibility is not complex enough for most organizations. And so that means we have to build or look at alternative solutions to provide the visibility that we're going forward with. And that becomes something that we really need to focus on is, okay, well, what decisions do we have to make to provide that visibility? And then we have all new acronyms that we have to look at. The first one here is cost usage reporting. So cost and usage reporting is something that was developed in 2017, coming from AWS initially. And this actually stems after even FinOps was introduced, right? So we didn't have visibility into a lot of these things early in the life cycles, and we're still continuing to get that. And so Project Autonomy with AWS really started looking and saying, how can I break out cost and usage in a more meaningful way? And so what was traditionally comma-separated reports now became JSON formats that we can use. And then we get those files from JSON, they started to split things into separate files. And that was acceptable because I can split up usage and cost and rate, because what I now got visibility in is into cost-saving measures. Like, what is my usage on my reserved instances, right? So reserved instances, or what is my committed usage discount? Where is it being applied to within those models? So now I can start seeing from a billing perspective, I can get at the data that I'm really looking for as part of the process. So then we understand what billing does. Then we have to say, well, what about DevOps? What are the key components of DevOps that make FinOps? And the first piece of that is, how do we apply automation to costs? How do we understand what to automate, when to automate? And we'll talk about that more as we talk about the life cycle. Then we have to think, well, what are we measuring? How are we providing those units of measure? And units of measure are very complex because it is difficult to understand the complexity of the billing, but also dollar amounts that we're dealing with. They can be in the tens of millions of dollars that are being there. And those are such large numbers that, again, from a human perspective, it's hard to understand what we're doing. So we can take theories and say, well, let's take a unit measure that means more to engineers overall. And so let's take a unit measure and say, well, what does a 12-pack of beer or a case look like? And we can apply that as a metric and say, well, this is how much the product cost in beer. And if we could say, oh, well, that cost us a lot of beer, we may not want to be doing that too much anymore. And so we can curb the behavior by just changing the unit of measure from something that is abstract and large, like dollar amounts, to something that we can visualize, something that we can work towards. And then engineers need to be working with accountants and procurements to talk about items like right sizing. How are we building things to use the right footprint and what we're going through? How we talk about utilization. How are we making sure that we're using the right amount of the resources that are available to us? So right sizing is about getting that right footprint. Utilization is making sure that we're using the most of it overall. How can we apply those concepts to the overall measures? So how many of our resources are now using reserved instances? Even if it's a Kubernetes cluster, the cloud providers allow you to apply reserved instance pricing to the underlying nodes in your Kubernetes cluster in order to take advantage of that. And so there's a very complex technical things that the engineers need to look at that bring that culture change to DevOps that can help the finance and procurement. But that then means the engineers need to learn some finance and procurement as well. And so we talked about initially, what's the most important financial term? And that was matching principle. Accrual and cash-based accounting are hard. Accrual accounting is all about charging back when the resources were used, not when they're billed. So the easiest way to think about that from an engineering perspective is we deal with accruals all the time in our daily life. We deal with them when it comes to billing for phone usage, for electrical, for gas, for things in our homes. We have costs that we used over a period of time. Sometime later, that was billed to us. And what accounting rule says is, well, we're not going to take the date that we receive that bill as when the cost occurred, because that's cash-based accounting. We're going to leave the prior piece open and apply that dollar amount to that prior period of time. So let's say it was the month of September, and I used $10,000 worth of cloud spend in September. I wouldn't get billed for that until October. But in accounting, I'm going to make sure that that was applied to the month of September. So when I look back, and I start looking back at futures, and I start looking back at these other concepts of how I'm managing and understanding capital cost and capital expenditure and cost of capital, I know when the period of that occurred. And it becomes very fundamental in terms of the calculations to make sure that we understand that this was hit our budget at this point in time based off of these accounting rules. And so we all understand a little bit more about matching principle. CapEx, OpEx has been discussed. We're moving from CapEx to an operational expense. Really, that is that we don't own the asset. And so it is truly an operational expense when we're in a public cloud. And so we have to change that. We're not accounting for depreciation of the asset, or the asset itself becomes part of the liability within the company. And then cost of capital expense is very different than operational expense. So it really means what's the asset of the company, whether it gets expensed and within a certain period of time, and how is that capital then moved towards the revenue being generated within cost of goods sold. So cost of capital is defining the cost of what we've implemented. Cost of goods sold then says, well, what is that cost of what we implemented related to when we got revenue? And that helps us define kind of where our cost margins are within the cloud. And that leads us finally to understanding. And understanding within the FinOps world is very important because we can define certain things around this. The first one that each pod should do, or even organizationally wide, is when it comes to FinOps is define what is determined as your North Star metric. So what is the most important metric you want to challenge every pod to do, or the pod to specifically measure in and of themselves? Build that into your gamification, into game of pods, so you can continue to track your progress towards that metric. Common metrics for North Star are employee satisfaction, customer satisfaction. I talked earlier a little bit about overall, days sales outstanding. This can be a very important metric because it can give you insights into your entire life cycle. So if you understand days sales outstanding, for example, if I got someone to build an extension on my house and they did it on time, on budget, and made everything, I'm going to pay them. If they were over budget, took too much time, there may be challenges to what that outstanding bill was, which means it's not going to get paid on time. And so I can start seeing metrics when I look at days sales outstanding. The other here is really wastage percentage. And this is a wonderful FinOps related metric that teams can use and can be compared to other teams. And so wastage percentage is basically taking the overall cost of our cloud spend that we have and taking the potential savings of what those resources are. So if I take potential savings divided by the overall cost, I can come up with a percentage that indicates what my potential waste is within that. And I can set thresholds that say, let's have targets and thresholds in place that are going to measure wasted percentage. And then we can define kind of what that looks like overall and grade teams on it in a way that says, okay, it's no longer, it's a percentage. So it doesn't matter if one team's cost is $1 million and the other's 1,000. We can still measure our potential savings that we have through the wasted percentage. And then we'll talk more about cost allocation, reduction and optimization as we learn more and more about the FinOps lifecycle. So that brings us to the FinOps lifecycle. And FinOps.org has 3 segments of the FinOps lifecycle. They have inform, optimize, operate. I'd like to think of this throughout my entire life doing cost management and doing FinOps as a practice, as really having 4. And I really break it into 4 because we always want to inform. We want to get at the data. Then what I add is I say, I want to reduce, right? I want to identify savings opportunity. I want to break that out from the optimization piece of it, because when I think of reduction in my head, and I'll talk about this more later on, it's really about how do I make impacts with the least amount of change? And so I want to take advantage of the low-hanging fruit, the nearest savings opportunities that there are within this situation, within what we're doing. And then I can move into optimize. And then optimize really is looking at the larger programs that are more complex. And so how do I really optimize? A lot of times this might require changes to code, changes to our architecture that we're working with. And then we want to get into operate. And operate really is the implementation of FinOps. And so this is where we're going to bring in continual integration, delivery, operations practices, and building the automation frameworks that we're looking for to create that consistency. And by creating that consistency, we'll create the credibility that's going to be in the model that we want to kind of move forward with. And so what does that really mean? So when we look at the first stage of this, the first stage being informed, this is probably one of the most critical steps that most teams that we're kind of going through and what we want to do. So we have a quick question here. I don't know if we want to answer it, but it says, when it's difficult and impossible to understand cloud billing from a human perspective, what do cloud providers do to develop trust that we are being billed is correct? If usage data that they provide is dense and the reporting tools break down, general understanding for the accounting purposes, maybe it's a root question. How do we keep the cloud providers honest? So cloud providers, so this is going to go into what we're talking about right here. This is going to go into informing, right? This is why this is such an important piece of the inform process that we're going through, because this is where we build the credibility in reporting, credibility in our cloud providers of what we're doing. So we're going to first understand our model, right? We'll go through and do showbacks or chargebacks or combination. And the difference between a showback and a chargeback is a showback is the bill, but doesn't expect payment. Chargeback is the bill and does require payment. And a lot of times, especially in SaaS-based products, we'll have a combination of showbacks and chargebacks to pods against their budgets. The second part of this then is looking at shared costs and how are you distributing shared costs. So when we talk about, okay, when we're breaking down that bill, we're breaking down that understanding, part of that is going to be shared costs that are across the enterprise. There are 3 different ways you can do shared costs. You can have it go to a centralized budget, like IT operations budget, and that is just paid by the organization. However, that then doesn't enable your teams to get visibility into their billing. So again, when we're talking about the billing and how we make sure it's correct, we want to get that budget and the bill back down to our pods so they can see the entire cost. They can then do the comparison of cost, right? Are we being billed for what we're using? Are we actually using these features that we're being billed for, that we're being recognized to? And they can do that reconciliation with at the pod level because it's their budget that they own. We've enabled them. We've given them autonomy for that budget. And then we can move away from cash-based accounting to accrual-based accounting. So again, we're talking about what we're being billed. We know the time period that we're billed and how much it costs and when that cost occurred. And we can see that. And then how do we see that is really talking about the taxonomy, right? The taxonomy in what we're building is very important because that's how we're tagging the resources. That's how we know that this resource belonged to this group that cost this much and went to this cost center as part of it. And so as you're starting with your taxonomy, a great place to start is called the Technology Business Management Taxonomy. It lays out kind of financial, IT, and asset taxonomy. And that's a great starting place if you're just moving along the journey as part of it. And then take that as a starting point and align it to your financial cost model, your chart of accounts that are going to be distributing those costs so that you can then take those chargebacks and that taxonomy, apply it to your chart of accounts so that you can see what the financial responsibility is going to be. Identify your KPIs that you want to track and measure, and then making sure that you have those tags to bill. So when you say, and the question was, is like, how do we make sure it's billed correct? I can tag resources, and each cloud provider allows me to say whether this tag is automatically applied to our bill. And so we can go there and do that in a very unique way as part of it. And this is all about preventing spend panic. And so in order to prevent spend panic, which causes larger churn in the organization, we can define how do we change accountability to autonomy. How do we make sure that what we're being billed is being applied to the business? And so this is something that needs to be discussed and in the FinOps model very early on, is that what we're being billed may be costly. And it may be a higher cost than what we thought. But is it providing more revenue? Is it still providing margin? Are we still making profit? Is our business still growing? And so the fact that the cost bill is growing within the cloud may not be as significant because it's providing more business value. And so we're having more business impact at higher cost. And that's okay to go through. And so as we establish that maturity model, as we establish that growth, we can then baseline where within the cycles that we're billed, we can say whether that meets specific thresholds that we're expecting. And as long as we're within thresholds, then that cost data doesn't become alarming because even though it's increasing at a threshold that we think is acceptable. And we can really apply that and prevent spend panic. And the second phase for this then is on reduce. And so reduce goals are all about how do I understand and detect the data that's there and how do I take action on it that's being provided. So when I got the data from my inform, now I want to set what my goals are. We talk about consistency, credibility being the top controls and goals that are in place, but we also want to talk about what it means from the iron triangle perspective. And the iron triangle is a management principle that says cost, time, and quality are all aligned. And when I make changes to one or the other, I'm going to impact. So if I want to increase time and increase quality, I'm going to have increased cost. If I want to decrease cost, I may have to decrease quality or increase time. And so they're interchangeable. And so when we understand what that is, we can understand, well, why are we making business decisions? And how does cost impact those business decisions to create the credibility, the sustainability, and the control that we're looking for overall. And then we want to talk about, my 4 key areas to look at for reduction. And reduction is opportunity to reduce costs without changing architecture. This can be done independently, potentially, of pods that are actually delivering. It cannot impact the pod delivery, but immediately reduce costs. And so we want to take a look at what are some of our unused resources. Make sure that we remove the waste. Are we right-sizing the resources and deployment models that we have out there so that we're using as little capacity as we possibly can? Can we schedule resources to turn them off so we're not being billed when they're not being used? And can we negotiate with our cloud service providers to get discounts? And if we can do that and apply discounts to our bill, we can immediately lower it. We haven't changed anything significantly at this point in time. And so we can look at that. And we can look at that by doing our detection of what we're doing. So number one, I've built programs like this multiple times. One is sleuthing, right? If our environment is not tagged, we don't have clear understanding, then we got to do some sleuthing. We got to do some detective work to kind of get in and understand what's being spent, where those spends are. We've got to define what our target state is. So we know where we are and where we're moving to. What is our target? If we understand what that target state is, then we can identify whether there's anomalies or controls and pieces in place. So if we understand if we violate target state, we can then set up alarms. We can set up budgets to control costs. We can set up quotas to limit spend in specific areas where we want to. So we can bring that visibility and those cost control mechanisms in place. And then finally, within the pods, we need to build feedback loops so that we can do that. So when we're looking at it, cost should be a continual conversation. At a minimum, it should be part of your demos and retros at the end of a sprint. So you can say, well, what did we spend this sprint? How did that compare to last sprint? Are we making progress towards what we're doing? It should be part of your daily routine of, are we looking at things? Are we spending too much? Are we leaving resources running that we shouldn't? How do we become more cost effective in what we're trying to do? Finally, we get to the optimize. And this is the big changes. Optimization generally takes much more design, much more architectural changes that are there, takes a lot of thought. And these are more complex metrics, more complex ways of dealing with the data that we're getting at. So when we do reduce, those are the low-hanging fruit. Those are easy things to understand. The best way to optimize your cost is going to be through your rates. Fundamentally, this is, how do you treat your cloud service providers? Do you treat them as a vendor or do you treat them as a partner? Because that's going to impact the rates that you're getting from the service providers. If you're treating them as a vendor, you're using competition to drive rates. If you're using them as a partner, you're going to use volume to drive rates. So you're going to say, I have committed to volumes that I'm going to spend with this cloud service provider in particular to drive down the rates and get lower costs. We're going to look at different models of costs. For example, storage pricing. There's generally multiple tiers within every cloud vendor around storage pricing. Whether it's availability, durability, performance, we can reduce costs by moving data into more cost-effective storage solutions based off the business needs. Additionally, we can look at, bring your own license models. Worked with one organization that already had Oracle licensing. And so moving and building products on AWS was more cost-effective because AWS RDS naturally already supported Oracle licensing. And in a bring your own licensing model, the actual cost for the RDS is less than what it would be for an open source version of the same database. So the organization's already paying for the Oracle licensing. You can actually have reduced costs from just an infrastructure footprint for using Oracle on RDS, similar to like Windows servers. I can bring Windows servers to licensing onto Azure and be able to reduce those licensing costs. If I'm already paying for them as an organization, I can leverage them within the different cloud service providers. So understanding how your licensing impacts the cloud is important. But on the reverse, if you've got third-party licensing and you're using tools within the cloud, understand how a traditional, maybe master-slave licensing agreement now gets translated over to an individual usage-based agreement. right? That can significantly increase your costs when you think about licensing, because what we were paying for on premise versus the number of servers and workers and nodes that we have available now gets applied to an organization of several thousand employees at a per head count, can be significantly more. And I've seen that happen as well on the reverse of bringing your own licensing in. Then we talk about redesigning. Redesigning is very important to what we're trying to do. We obviously understand that we need to make reservations. This is the bridging the gap, right? So we need to use reserved instances. FinOps does not talk about log management enough. This is a significant cost to organizations. I've had multiple conversations about how do I reduce my elk stack, how do I reduce my Splunk, how do I get better visibility in my logs. It's really about doing log optimization, aggregation, looking at those patterns that can be very significant savings just from a log. Relocating assets is important as well. So we want to be able to reduce egress costs within the network as much as we possibly can. And then we wanted to continually to improve, right? We want to become more cloud native. We want to use enhanced resources that are going to be available to us. Oftentimes we're using default configuration from our CCOE. We need to change that based off of what our business needs are. And then we want to look at, what are some basic strategies to kind of get over that hump. And so one of the ways I really like to think about this is set up zones that are going to be where you are in that progression. So a green zone, for example, is proven technology, proven patterns that are repeatable for our teams. Red zones are evolving patterns, new patterns that we're working on that may be higher cost for a period of time until we learn and improve upon those. And then black zones are potentially areas that we don't want to use anymore. So these are things that are off limit. We can identify if someone's using a black zone and then get help. If you're at the point and you need help, get help. There are a lot of third-party services that have managed solutions for clouds that help with cost management. And so, taking the time to look at, do I want to build it? Do I want to buy it? Is very important into your overall infrastructure. And so when we talk about, that whole process, do I want to build? Do I want to buy? We really talk about, what that operate phase looks like. And operate is all about achieving the results, take small steps, change the vernacular to be a carrot versus a stick. If you do have an incident where you have bad citizens, talk to them. They're not intentionally trying to do something malicious. It may just be we're trading trade-offs right now between quality and cost, or time and cost. We're making trade-offs. And be aware that a lot of times the best action is just no action at all. So once you use the data, make data-driven decisions as you're moving forward. Define your metrics, have the right outcomes within the environment, and then use the automation that's in place, right, to really provide the tooling. You can automate a lot of what you're doing within your processes that are going to be there. So you can automate reporting, you can automate tag governance, build a overall database of all your tags, have them automatically applied to resources when they're created, based off of roles of what's being created, so kind of how that tag has been applied. No longer becomes part of what engineers have to do. You can build forecasting models. You can schedule the forecasting to be done. And then additionally, look at your tooling and work very closely with your security, because at its core, FinOps is going to need very direct access to the environment. And so security is going to want to be involved to be able to understand how that data and how that access is going to be produced. And that's also going to help build your overall credibility. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for your time today, and welcome to have any questions that you may have regarding FinOps.
Great, thank you, Dustin. Appreciate the conversation that you've started here. We do have a couple questions. If we have time, we'll see. The first question is, you mentioned that it's difficult or maybe impossible to understand cloud billing from as a human, which I think is absolutely true. So what should cloud providers do, or what tools maybe do exist that you can point to, or basically, if I'm in this situation, and frankly we all are, how do I keep the cloud providers honest? How do I, what do I do to comprehend these incomprehensible, dense bills?
Yeah, so the first goes back to your tooling, right? There was an open source product out there, I think Capital One created it, called Cloud Custodian. So take a look at that, and that can help give you insights initially into what you're doing. There's obviously a huge number of third-party products that are out there as well that are going to be able to give you that insight. But honestly, Rocky, when it comes to that question, that responsibility is really being placed back on the pod, right? Because if we move the budget to the pod level of the team that's owning it, they are able to have that micro focus on making sure things are accountable and billed correctly, and then elevate that to the FinOps team. Because when we think about the scaling, the FinOps team is not going to be able to, that community and team is not going to be able to just respond to that independently. But by applying the tags, by applying what we're doing as best practices, by including budget and cost into our standard sprints, we're going to make sure that what we're billed for and what we're using is what we're being billed for and what we're using. Because the teams will know that inherently once we give them the visibility. So it's all about bringing that visibility to them so that we can do that reconciliation process. We have one more question, it looks like, as well.
We do. So regarding, I think largely this question is around procurement and kind of who has responsibility for procuring cloud, providers, contracts, and so forth. And so it seems like a lot of this does happen out of procurement groups and negotiations with the big cloud vendors and whatnot. And this FinOps process and model that you're talking about seems like it takes maybe some of the responsibility away from that traditional part, or maybe I'm misunderstanding. Maybe it's more of a partnership between procurement and other parts of the org. But is there any like templates, models, cookbooks? I mean, this seems like a culture change within a lot of orgs, right?
It is a huge culture change. What we found is when we went to the OpEx model with pods, we bypassed procurement in the whole process because they were no longer involved in this is what I'm going to spend and here's how much it's going to cost. I was simply prioritizing velocity over anything else and trying to be as fast as I can. And so we bypassed all procurement. And that's where FinOps really builds that culture back because we want to have the responsibility for purchasing as low with the teams as we possibly can. And so procurement, rather than being a gated approval process and the template, becomes a partner that is going to use that data to drive rate negotiation with the cloud service providers. So their role is changing because now they're focused on how do I get my team the best rates? How do I get them the best opportunity to drive down costs? And then teams, you're responsible for a budget that we preset and we understand what that is. And you can spend within that budget. And then if you have exceptions, let's go back up to the procurement community. But we're trying to limit the amount of gating that we're trying to do within the process to drive spend. A really good example of that too is like, even within Google and other industries, a lot of teams have preset spend budgets that they're just assigned and say, you can have spend up to $10,000 for your specific community within this area that you can use. And then it's your responsibility for how you use it and how you manage it moving forward. So that's kind of what you want to shift. You want to build that pod model. And part of the basis of the pod model is budget, right? That's one of the founding principles of the pod model is that you're responsible for your budget, whatever that's set to and what you need. And you're going to set that budget as a pod based off of your analysis on what you're building and what you're going to need. For instance, say, I can make a request for this much budget. Procurement say, yes, that budget is approved. You can spend. And then keep control of that budget, be alerted when you're out of control with that budget. Versus the model now today, which is there is no budget and teams are just spending and no one has visibility into it, right? So you got to build that collaboration back and you got to bring procurement into it. And that's why they're part of the FinOps culture and the part of the FinOps community and team, because they're really shifting that model. And their focus, like I said, it becomes much more focused on how can I work with our cloud service providers to get the best rates and drive down our costs. So they want to be armed with that data and what our spends are so they can go back and say, hey, we can use competitive advantage to us, or we can use volume as a way to drive down those costs.
One final question. Yeah, and I think you kind of alluded to this at one point, and that was you made the comment about bringing things in-house versus public. And it seems to me like FinOps could drive hybrid clouds because the way cost occurs or racks up in a public cloud is essentially the opposite of the way cost racks up in a capital expenditure by having my own data center.
Yeah.
Right. And so it seems like in some cases it could be a pretty substantial benefit by having being able to take advantage of one capital cost model versus a operational cost model by leveraging or playing public against private cloud or internal. Or am I missing that? Or
no, you're absolutely right. I mean, there are many cases where it is much more cost effective to have my resources be in the data center than they are in the cloud. We know like simple lift and shift and those type of philosophies drive up cost. I mean, they're more costly than the data center by practice. So unless I'm modernizing to some level to better build business impact, right, and build those costs, there's a really, and I can provide this later on, there's a really good understanding about how we thought data center cost was going to go down because we're going to replace it with cloud and it's going to go up. That doesn't actually happen, right? So if we look at cost of spend of data centers over time, it's actually remained pretty flat, kind of slow growth going up. Cloud costs went increasingly up because we're just producing more, right? We're building more software products. We're able to build them more easily in the cloud than we have in data centers. So we're just doing more. And so we're driving up cloud costs while data center still remains kind of in the picture. So hybrid cloud model is a reality of almost every enterprise. And so you got to use FinOps to make the decision. Say, does it make sense for this particular resource to go to the cloud, or is it more effective to be in my data center? And even larger, if you have huge cloud spend, do the reverse and say, does it make more sense to move off of the cloud, public cloud, and back into my data center like Dropbox did? Dropbox saved millions by moving off of the cloud because their big expense was all storage of data and things like that were very expensive in the cloud. And so they could optimize those costs by moving it back into the data center. And so, yeah, FinOps needs to apply to both. It cannot just be public cloud. It also needs to include private cloud or data center.
Well, this has been fantastic, Dustin. I really appreciate you taking the time today to give this fantastic keynote. And I hope everybody listening continues to enjoy Programmers Week.
Yeah, I do too. Have a great Programmers Week, everyone. It was wonderful talking to you today. Have a great week. This is fantastic. I'm looking forward to all the speakers this week.